Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with American jazz gem and musician Mr. Lee Roth. This journeyman jazz cat out of St. Louis spent rich years in New York City collecting stories, from Duke Ellingto to Paul Chambers and beyond. Along with tales from his own playing days and plenty of wisdom sprinkled in, I caught him on stage at a Lonnie McFadden show at the Black Dolphin in early 2019, and he's a cat brimming with jazz good. So get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
Thanks for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz. I appreciate it, man.
That's cool.
So I just want to start off the top with the fact that I met you at a Lonnie McFadden show. You got up on stage during a break. Lonnie had just played Take 5, and you were explaining being there and how he allocated the rights to that song to the American Red Cross and that it had made millions over the years. So that was kind of our window of meeting. I knew that you were in the jazz world, so I'll let you take the baton and run with it from there and kind of talk to me about your life in jazz and some stories and however you want to orchestrate it.
My background is I played all over the goddamn place and opened for a bunch of people and shit, but that's not important. I'm sort of semi-retired. Anyway, but I want to go through my experiences in New York. I got them all written. That's the way I conceived of it. And then after that we can talk about me, but let's just talk about stuff that I think is history. I went to New York a number of times, a number of periods of time. The first one was in 1962. I went there with my wife. We got married and decided we wanted to try out life in New York. I got a job for Hertz Rent-A-Car, and I was an accountant. I went from office to office. I worked at a different office every day to do their accounting, and that was an interesting experience. And I went to an office up in Dyckman Street, which is way up at the tip of Manhattan. I did my report of business. The weekly report of business took about a half an hour, and they kept the office open for a guy that lived over in Riverdale. He was the owner of a company, of a brazier company. Anyway, so they kept it open for him, and there was just no business up there. But the one thing I had to do when I went there on Tuesday was to pick up Mrs. Handy, and I said, okay. And I said, let me look at the rental agreement, and bigger than, I don't know, capital letters, it said Mrs. W.C. Handy. And I about got flushed, and I said, oh, my God. So every Tuesday I used to go pick up Mrs. Handy over in Riverdale and bring her back and rent her a car, and she took the car, and she was a very elderly woman, but a sharp person, and she would just take it all day, and she'd bring it back, and then I'd drive her back home and bring the car back. So we had a lot of talks about her and Bill. He wrote the St. Louis Blues, which is technically the first blues song ever published, but the history doesn't show it that way, and I'll tell you why. They got $200 for the St. Louis Blues, and the lawyer screwed up on making out the contract, and so they didn't get any residual or didn't get paid their portions of the sales of the St. Louis Blues until ASCAP and BMI became in the scene, which was way longer. She said, we made no money on the St. Louis Blues, but we made all our money on the Memphis Blues. And I said, okay, and I don't even know the Memphis Blues. I know it's popular down south, but, well, the St. Louis Blues is known all over the world. It might be the most recorded song from America in the Western Hemisphere. It's outrageous what that went on. So then ASCAP and BMI became in the scene, and then she started to get the residuals after W.C. died. And that's the reason she lives in Riverdale and not in a little apartment in Memphis. W.C. Handy's favorite song that he wrote was the Yellow Dog Blues. And I could whistle it, but anyway, I could try, but we won't do it over the radio. But it's a neat little tune, and the meaning of it is, at that time when he wrote it, there was a thing called, if you wanted to get a job at a company, some of the companies would have you sign a Yellow Dog contract. And that means that if you work for them, you will never join a union. And that's a Yellow Dog contract. And that's what he wrote the Yellow Dog Blues about that issue. And that's an interesting point, I think, for me. So one day, she called me, and she had taken the car out, and she blew a fuse. And I kept a collection of fuses so I could fix the cars simply without having to call a mechanic if possible. And so I went over to put the fuse in and figure it out, and I did. And she was over in Harlem, up Sugar Hill. She said, "When do you want to come in?" And I said, okay, so I went inside, and she introduced me to Mr. Duke Ellington, which was a preposterous surprise as well, and he was just an absolute princely, gracious, humble, just a general guy. It was just really a great experience to meet him, and he just was totally just a normal person and listened very carefully to what I said, which I was listening. I mean, he was just with you. It was absolutely just a powerful experience. One of the things I found out about the A Train, he had Billy Strayhorn under contract to write tunes for the band, and he wrote, I don't know, maybe one every day or one every a lot. And one of the tunes he wrote was the A Train. You know, Duke took a look at it, and he, with all the other stuff that he had for that week, and he thought it was a little corny, and he put it in the trash can. Mercer, who was taking lessons at that time, took it out of the trash can and started to play it, and Duke sort of thought, well, you know, that might swing, and sort of got connected with the piece, and that's the history of the A Train. From Sweet Pea, that they call him Sweet Pea, Billy Strayhorn. Yep, I think he was one of the greatest composers as well with Duke, but he also, you know, his style of composing I find very, very lyrical and beautiful, and just a really powerful individual. So we'll go to another chapter here. I was down in working in the main office one day. So somebody came in, Archie Shep and Eric Dolphy came in to rent a car. They didn't have the credit cards that Hertz wanted. I told them, these are really important musicians. They were taking the car over to see the Baroness, and I'll get into the Baroness in a minute. I said, you know, they come up with about $100 between them for a deposit, and I said, that'll be cool. And if there would be a balance, or if they would keep the car longer, I'd cover it. So they allowed me to rent them a car. I was sort of proud of that. They were going over to see the Baroness. Now, this is a really unbelievable story. The Baroness Pannonica, Pannonica, deep Königswater. If you look it up on Google, it's the Baroness Pannonica, Pannonica. And she was an absolutely gorgeous, fantastic woman. She came over here to the States on a holiday, and she was in New York, and she heard the Duke. She heard Monk play. It blew her away to such an extent. Now, you won't believe this. She went back home, and she packed up her stuff, including her money. She was an heiress of the Rothschilds, which probably was the largest amount of money in one family. Certainly at that time, it was like billions and billions and billions of dollars, and she was one of the heiresses of that money. So she was enormously rich beyond our comprehension. So she packed all of her stuff, left her 5 children and her husband, and came to live with Monk. That's an unbelievable event. Okay, it just sounds like I made it up. It's just so crazy. She is Nika. Okay, you know Nika's Dream.
Oh yeah.
And well, that's who. And they lived together till Monk died in her castle over in New Jersey. She had a place, and she loved jazz, and so that place became a jazz office for her friends, which were mostly all African-American jazz players, but some others as well. It was open day and night for jazz, for jamming, for partying, for talking, for living, eating, drinking, the whole damn thing. It was an open jazz office, okay, with anything that you wanted there. She had these get-togethers, which were sometimes organized, you know, with a jam with Diz and Bird and Monk. I mean, and others. It was unbelievable and outrageously wonderful and relaxed, and just the jams would go many times far into the night, and the people would be drinking and doing other stuff, and you could just stay over, because she had I don't know how many rooms she had in this place, but it was just a nut. A good friend of mine, Joel Forrester, had a group called People Like Us. It was a little quartet, and he's still playing. He's over in Europe right now with his wife, but I think he'll be back, and he lives in New York. He, as a young man, I don't even, let's say he was 20, 25, I don't know, but he just was attached to Monk. He was a follower of Monk, and he was a believer in Monk, and so he got invited over to the Baronesses, and he would play for Monk, and Monk would play for him, and they, anyway, it was a great experience for him. And also one of the deals, Monk, he liked to hear music when he went to sleep, to go to sleep, and so Joel would play for him a lot of times. He was be in a bedroom with the door sort of halfway open, and they had pianos all over the place. And Joel is a piano player, and he would just play until Monk fell asleep. And so that I think that he has a group, two people like us, and then he also wrote all the music for the Microscopic Septet, which you may have heard of. I produced the first CD of people like us in New York when I was there. And I also produced the last CD of the Microscopic Septet, which is called Microscopic Septet Play the Blues. I pretty well paid for that. Anyway, and Joel is one of my dearest friends. He's outrageously wonderful, beautiful, intelligent character, and I love him like crazy. That's the story of the Baroness. And now the Baroness was like a social worker for jazz. She would take care of these guys. Sometimes they got in financial trouble, so she'd pay their rent. Sometimes they could just move in out there until things got straightened up. If anybody had thought they were getting chiseled on a contract, that they told her, she had a group of lawyers on retainer, and she would just stick these lawyers on them, and things were solved in days, okay, because they were some hotshot lawyers. I mean, people, it was like being sued by General Motors. I mean, so this was one of her, the kind of a way to be a benefactress of jazz, and she was just an unbelievable person that everybody could depend on. Her friends could depend on her for every damn thing. I met her many times at gigs and mostly at the Vanguard, but anyway, she was just an outrageous apostle of jazz, and a very important one too, because she really took care of people. Bird died there, living there. And Monk died there in 1985 of a stroke. He passed in 1988. So that's about the Baroness. And, well, your listeners could look this up. There's been books written about her, the Baroness Canonica. Just an amazing individual, an amazing period of jazz.
I remember in the film that Eastwood made that Parker was there, and the night that he died, she attested to a thunderclap that was something that no one really had ever heard over New York at that time. It was so loud.
Oh yeah.
There was a
really?
thunderclap. Yeah. So
that's
what
kidding.
The legend does. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah,
wow. And that's where he was. That's very appropriate and was a tragic day for jazz. But and he died of a heart attack. And I hope he didn't. And so I assume he didn't die from the thunderclap. But the thunderclap was a response to his passing into another degree of inspiring people in another world. That's that chapter. Now, then I was working in the office of Hertz on West 87th Street in Manhattan. One evening, a guy walked in and said, hello, I'm a musician, and it was Brew. And I said, I know, and Brubeck, and so we got to talking, and he said, I when I need to do gigs in New York, I need a station wagon and blah, blah, blah for the bass and drums and stuff. And I said, Eugene Wright was currently the bass player, and Joe Morello. I said, okay, you see that station wagon over there? That's yours. So I kept the car for Boo. Got close with the band, through that, and also on gigs and visited. And Joe used to come down. He lived right a couple blocks away, and he'd come over and visit me on Thursdays and in the evenings sometimes, and we'd talk about life. He was basically legally blind. When he walked in my office, he held his hand on the wall. He was very, very legally blind, I'm sure without his glasses, and was just a very engaging individual, and we had a lot of nice talks, and he was just wonderful. And Brew was an absolute saint. He was just outrageously sweet, intelligent, engaging, humble individual, just a wonderful person. I am honored to have met him and know him and it was just outrageous. That was early on, and then later on, in the 1977, I was on a visit to New York and found out that Paul Desmond was ill in the hospital, and so I had started to. He had his girlfriend, his lady friend, Gloria Steinem, and him had some kind of an argument, so she wouldn't visit him, and he had no family in New York, basically, and except the jazz family, so a number of us would visit him whenever we could, and so on one of our visits, some guy walked in and in a suit and tie and everything, and Paul said, I got to talk to this guy for a minute, he's my lawyer, so we moved the room was sort of a small room, so we just sort of moved around to the bathroom area, you know what I mean? And I heard him say it, and I couldn't help but hear it, and I wasn't, listening, but and the guy just said, Paul, what we need to solve today, if we can, is just what are you going to do with the residuals for Take 5? And Paul said, I don't know, just put down the Red Cross, and we'll talk about it later. He died 4 days later, and so it has occurred that all the residuals from Take 5 since 1977 have gone to the Red Cross, which currently have amounted to about $6 million. Just an amazing thing that I was. I don't know that I witnessed. I guess that's another chapter. I used to jam with Cecil Taylor in Brooklyn in the 80s. I got to know him up there, and so that was cool. One day I used to go. I lived in the Chelsea when I first moved to New York for a couple of years. I got a sublet there. That was a wonderful idea. The Chelsea Hotel, and that was an unbelievable place to stay. They were always shooting interviews or whatever the hell in the lobby, and Mia Farrow's kids were running all over the place. And the deal was is you took a room there. Mr. Bard, who was the owner at the time, and I guess probably was the owner until he died. The deal was, there were a lot of famous people stayed there, and the deal was, you just treated them like regular people. You didn't give them, you didn't hassle them about at all. You just, they were just your neighbors, and it was important to just treat them like neighbors. So they would feel like they had some privacy, and people weren't always bothering them. So that was an interesting, great experience. And so Jimmy Rose was Miles Davis' road manager, and he lived there. And I knew he lived there, but I didn't know what he did. And he was a good buddy of Mr. Bard, who was the owner of the Chelsea. And some high school in Chelsea was opening up a music wing, and wanted to have Miles play at the dedication. Well, this was in '88 when Miles was screwed up, okay, and so but he agreed to play, but Cannonball and the rest of the guys were all over the world, and so he told Jimmy to talk to Mr. Bard, because there was a lot of musicians that lived at the Chelsea, and asked if there were some people there that would, be willing to come and join him in a small group and help in this dedication, and I was one of the people that Mr. Bard asked, and so I of course said, of course, and without basically any rehearsal, because the idea was we knew what the hell we were doing, and that's the kind of people that Miles wanted. You know what I mean? And we played a couple tunes, and also Maiden Voyage. He thought that would be appropriate for a new high school starting out with a music wing. And now I'm going to sort of get into this. I respect Miles as a musician exponentially. However, he was the most difficult, arrogant, abusive person I think I have ever met.
Yeah.
He was a very, very hostile, just difficult individual. And I've talked to some players since then, and they said, well, he was, at that period in his life, he was just really hostile, particularly to white people, and I happened to have been one. So that's what was going on with Miles at that time. But it was an honor to play the music with him, but it was a very, very difficult experience. So that's another chapter. And then I guess I spent a lot of time in New York after that, and since 1988, I got remarried and to a woman in New York, and she was I guess it wasn't stated, but anyway, it was a great part of our relationship that she was also a jazz enthusiast, and so we used to go down and to the Vanguard a lot and heard the band down there, and also I met Bobby Watson down there a number of times with me and my wife. We talked to him a lot, and he's here, isn't he, in the jazz school in Kansas City, I believe. Bobby Watson.
Yeah, he is actually he's the director of jazz studies down at UMKC.
Okay, well, he is a magnificent person. He is just extremely communicative, very knowledgeable, and just a very prince of a person. He he has a outrageously great spirit, phenomenal person. And if you can, I guess you probably have interviewed him, or if you haven't, you can expect that. He's just a phenomenal individual. Was playing with a lot of different bands down there, and I think probably with what's the big band that used to play down there, and also got to know Doc Cheatham. He played at the Sweet Basil every week, and we used to go down and see him and talk to him a lot. And interesting thing about Doc, he was very involved with Billie Holiday years ago, and he dated her and stuff, and then she moved on and he moved on, I guess. But he was always very regretted the fact that she didn't marry him, because he felt that if she would have had a healthier, happier life from then on. You know what I mean? Other than some of the difficult things that Billy went through inside and out. So I guess that's the end of my sort of experiences in New York that I have put down, and so that's the end of my contacts in New York. Now, about me, I started out in St. Louis, and eventually put together a group called the Expression Jazz Quintet, which was made up of some students. I did a jazz workshop with some gifted students from a high school. They asked me at one point after the thing was all over with and everything, a number of months went by, and they had a little gig downtown and asked me if I wanted to come. So I said, sure, sit in. So really outrageously good players, and we had a lot in common, and we were all in the same key. That became the Expression Jazz Quintet, these students of mine and me, and we played all over St. Louis and a lot in Chicago and some in Atlanta, and was basically fusion and a lot of originals. So that was that, and it was a great band. And when that eventually broke up, I started the Forecast Jazz Ensemble, which was here in St. Louis, basically. We played all over the damn place, and that was my next group. That was before I went to New York on my second trip. So, and currently I do I like some of the older Ellington stuff and Joe Beam and just a variety of the more lyrical things. I like fusion, and I got a chance to meet in Chick Corea and Gary Burton. I did a workshop with him, and I love fusion. But what I like to play is the old historic stuff and the more lyrical stuff, and also I got into playing. I always, as a hobby, I played harmonica and blues stuff. Some people think I'm pretty good at it, so I teach some. I've got some students for that. I want to play. I'm not a blues player. I never take a gig to play blues all night. I just, as a jazz player, blues just don't get it. There's things you want to say in the language, and the language isn't there. The language is in jazz because you've got all the harmonies and all the modes and all the freedom to express more complex, thoughtful, the kind of ideas that I have, and but so the blues is okay, but I never take a blues gig all night. I'll come in, I'll play a couple tunes and drink a couple beers and move on. The blues is boring to me after a while, and it's just not complex enough. Once you get initiated into jazz and to the language of jazz, it's a vocabulary that that is a large vocabulary, and the blues vocabulary is much smaller, and I can't express some ideas and thoughts that I have in the blues. However, I'm not going to say I don't like the blues. It was the history of jazz, and so I guess that's it. And I'd like to just mention too, the blues started out, among the African Americans that were enslaved and et cetera, and basically after the Civil War, a lot of them, the Mississippi River was a convenient place because you could work your way down on the boats to New Orleans, and you could also work your way up to St. Louis. Was a handy way for people with no money to get someplace, and of course that's basically, I think, the historical reason why New Orleans and St. Louis became development places of the blues and ragtime and Dixieland, etc. Particularly in St. Louis. St. Louis was like the New York of the country at that point in the Midwest, because there was people there starting out going west and everything, and people had money, and there was places that the black musicians could play, which they couldn't play in the regular clubs. They weren't allowed to. St. Louis was a center for bordellos as well as everything else. But I mean, there was a lot of houses of prostitution here in St. Louis and East St. Louis. So the blues, well, these were blues players, but they wanted to play in a party or a place where people were having fun, and so they developed ragtime music, which was a development, one of the development of the blues. That was the place that black musicians could play, in the whorehouses. And I guess I'll ask the question: when do you go to a house of prostitution? And the answer is ragtime. That's the source of the name. And I think it's interesting, and people need to know that, and nothing to be ashamed of. Just what it was. That's history. A lot of people don't know that, but St. Louis was the center, was a developmental place for ragtime. I guess also New Orleans, but St. Louis is more known for that, as far as I know. And of course, the development of ragtime into Dixieland, which was integrated, and the white players learned how to picked it up, and then it was an integrated deal. Mostly white players did Dixieland, but anyway, that was that. And then it goes historically, some of the 1920s, 19 or so. I'm talking jazz history now because I've studied it and I did this on the radio as well. But some players started experimenting with different modes and different chord progressions and different harmonic ideas. It was called jackass music because it was not in the same genre as Dixieland, and had different harmonies and everything else. So people were confused by it, and they called it jackass music. And then after a few years, then they changed the word jackass to jassac, Jassac, put the word jackass backwards, okay? So, and then that got shortened to jazz, Jass, just because that was from the jassac music. And then, of course, the Jass eventually got to be called jazz. And that's the history of I just like to share that. It's an interesting concept of how jazz developed. And so I'll just put that in because that's part of my insightfulness and part of my research. I think I don't know if you've ever told that story, but I think it's good for people to know how jazz became what it is.
It is. It's interesting. And I've heard bits and pieces of it, and to hear kind of the evolution verbally, it's great. Yeah. But
I use it on my. I thought it was my idea. Well, it was my idea. I use the term jazz is a tree. It's a large, beautiful tree with its roots in the blues. This tree has many branches which have all different leaves and all different beautiful flowers upon it. Okay, and so there are in each branch is a different type of jazz, and so there are many emoluments of jazz, as you know, directions as we call it, and still going on. And of course, it's influenced classical music and everything else was just drastically. Ravel and Gershwin, obviously, who was just a phenomenal player and loved to play jazz and loved to play at parties. He was a party guy, Gershwin. Anyway, so jazz has gone worldwide now, and so this is some of the background that I know and where I was lucky and blessed to be a part of it all my life, and it will continue to be until I poop it out. That's pretty much up to what I've got to say currently.
Perfect. Lee, thank you for opening up. Thank you for your story. I knew that I was going to get a good one or a good net of stories. So thanks for taking some time out from Neon Jazz, man. I appreciate it. Keep on doing the good work.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players and storytellers in New York, St. Louis, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Lee for his time, his music, and his cool. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.